thank all of you for coming out tonight, and thank Holly and everybody at Sims Library for inviting me out. I'm very excited. So if I seem nervous, please forgive me, because I've been waiting for tonight for most of my life, and that's not an exaggeration. I really thought this night would happen about 30 years ago, because if you knew me in college, I was always writing manuscripts and short stories, and anytime I had a free minute, I was writing things down, and I know I wore my friends out, because every time we would get together, I would say, oh, you got to read what I just wrote. And looking back in hindsight, I know they probably dreaded that, but they were always very nice and very encouraging. He goes, wow, this is really good, which just fueled fire. But when I was in college, I really thought this was what I was going to be doing for a living, writing books and standing in front of folks like you and talking about my books. You know, the way things worked out, tonight's the first night I get to do this. So it's really a dream come true for me. My grandmother was born in 1901 in the back of a covered wagon crossing the mountains from Spartanburg, South Carolina into North Carolina. My grandfather was born in 1895 in Bryson City, North Carolina. And my mom is the baby of 12 kids. And they had spent pretty much their entire life living in the hills. So when I tell you I'm a hillbilly and I come from a family of hillbillies, I really mean it, because they lived in the mountains. And they lived in a rent house on the top of a mountain. And they got electricity the year I was born. And about 4 or 5 years later, in the mid-60s, they got indoor plumbing. They pretty much everything that they needed, they grew. They got from the woods. And I remember sitting on my papa's shoulders where he was plowing his garden behind a mule, and I was riding on his shoulders as he would make the rows. And then I spent lots of time picking vegetables and weeding in the garden with him. It was a huge garden, and it's all part of perspective, because if I'm not even going to venture to say how big it is, because one of my cousins is going to see this or hear this, and then I'll never hear the end of it. But as a kid, it was huge. And they lived on top of a hill. It was really a mountain, but it was top of a hill. The Creasmans lived across the road. You couldn't really see their house because of the road. You could see another house off to the right. It was another rent house. And down in the corner, I do not remember the family's name who lived there, but I remember he was a TV repairman, and he used to take me to school when I missed the bus. But I had a very wonderful childhood, very blessed childhood. And that's where I'm from, the mountains of northwestern North Carolina. And I remember those stories that Granny and Papa told of the olden days, and the ways. And it's not just the stories, it's how they lived their life. I don't want to say they never went to the store. They did. They'd go to the store and buy staples, but they grew their own food. They had chickens, they had pigs. Every year, Papa would make blackstrap molasses with his brother, and that was fun. I really enjoyed that. But that was just the way of life that they lived. And then when Dad came back from Vietnam, he got orders to go to Fort Jackson in Columbia, South Carolina, and become a drill sergeant. So for the first time, I moved away from the mountains. And they rented a house in Denny Terrace, which is in North Columbia. And I started 4th grade at Denny Terrace Elementary School. Well, at that time, South Carolina was still in the very early stages of integrating schools. So it was very contentious, to say the least. That's putting it very politely. And the elementary school I went to, it was about 80% black and 20% white. So coming from very rural western North Carolina, where I was related to almost everybody that was in my class, it was kind of a culture shock. My very first day of school at Denny Terrace Elementary,
I will never forget this. We had recess, so we go outside to play recess. I don't know anybody. I'm just kind of hanging out, and this white kid who happened to live 3 houses down from my parents' house on When You Drive decides that he's going to beat up the new kid. So he throws me down on the ground, and I'm laying down on the ground, I'm covering my face, and he's just pummeling me, and then all of a sudden it stops, and I'm peeking through my fingers, and I see him being raised up off the ground by this big black kid with one hand, tosses him by the monkey bars, and he reaches down and picks me up, and he says, "My name's Daryl Black." And I told him my name, and he goes, "Huh, white and black." We not only became friends, we became best friends. Until in 9th grade, my dad got orders to move to Germany, so from 4th grade through the end of our 8th grade year, Daryl and I were best friends. He stayed over at my house, and which I don't even want to go into how ugly that was. I'll say we both received it from both sides of the color line on that. It wasn't a popular thing to do, but we were friends. We judged each other by character, and I would ask Daryl if I could go to his house, and he said, "No, that's not a good idea." And I said, "Why can't I go to your house?" Because he would spend the night with me, and we would both take a bunch of flack about that. I said, "Why can't I go to your house?" And he said, "Well, my older brother doesn't like white people, so I don't think that would be a good idea." And it wasn't until 6th or 7th grade when Daryl told me why. And then all of a sudden I understood why. And going back to Denny Terrace Elementary School, in 5th grade, we had an assignment in our teacher's class. Irene Wolf was our teacher, and we had to write poetry. Well, I wasn't a very big fan of poetry, so that night I went home and I don't know, I just being a smart aleck, I made up this poem called 12 Pigs Go to Heaven. And it was a nonsense poem. And I was really kind of taking it half-hearted because I didn't want to do the assignment, and it was kind of a smart alecky poem. And the next morning when we had to turn it in, I was almost embarrassed to turn it in because I thought I was going to get in trouble, that the teacher was going to think, "Oh, you're being a real smart aleck." But I turned it in, and we were doing something else when she was grading papers, and after lunch we had our poetry class, or our language arts class, and she called me up to the front of the room and goes, "I want you, Mr. White, to read your poem." And I thought, oh man, she's going to embarrass me in front of the whole class. I'm never going to live this down. My dad's going to find out, and I'm going to whip him when I get home. And I was trembling when I walked up to the front of the class, and she handed me my paper back and she said, "Class, this is one of the best poems that I've read since I've been doing it." And she'd been teaching like 40 years. And I'm looking at her, I'm thinking, okay, are you pranking me? And I pulled her aside and I said, "Mrs. Wolf," I said, "this is a nonsense poem. I don't want to get in trouble." But she goes, "No, it's wonderful, read it." So I had to read it in front of the class. And after I finished reading, she said, "Mr. White, you have a gift. You should think about a career in writing." And that was the first time anybody other than my parents had ever told me that I had a gift, that I was good at something. And I never forgot that. Well, Mrs. Wolf actually lived 8 houses down on the same street I did. So we stayed in touch long after I finished 5th grade. I saw her almost on a daily basis, and even when I moved away, we still wrote to each other, and she was very supportive and very nurturing. In 9th grade, my dad got orders to move to Germany. And, okay, I'm from the South. I had a wonderful, wonderful childhood. We didn't have much in the way of money, but I never went hungry, and I had lots of love. So I come from a very, very humble beginnings, but I had never been out of the South. And the only, other than going to visit my aunts and uncles during the summer, I'd never been away from home. And so here I am in a foreign country and living in a dorm on top of it, totally on my own. I'm 14 years old, living in a boarding school in Germany. And, later on when I came back to the States, when I was being smug and arrogant about it, I said, I went to a European boarding school. The truth is, the dorm was a cross between George Orwell's Animal House and National Lampoon's Animal Farm. My first year in high school was absolutely horrible. It was really, really bad. I had trouble adjusting. I had trouble getting along. It really was like Animal House and National Lampoon. There was very few rules, and the older kids that were, and I was a freshman, so the seniors pretty much ran the show, and I don't have very fond memories of that first year. But I remember in Mr. Roberts' English class, our freshman English class, we had to write a persuasive essay. And I wrote on some topic on social justice. And I remember I was all fired up. And I really, I just let it rip. And I wrote this scathing essay, and I turned it in, and I thought, he's probably going to give me a bad grade because I kind of got on a high horse there. Once again, he called me up and he made me read my essay in front of the class. And then after I was finished, he said, Neal, you really ought to think about going into a career of editorial writing. And second time I heard that word, he said, you have a gift. And then I thought, editorial writing, newspapers? There is no way in the world I'm going to do that. I want nothing to do with newspapers. So I finished high school and I graduated in Germany. I graduated a year early. I tell everybody I was a prodigy, but actually I just worked my tail off to get all the credits because I didn't want to have to go back to the States and finish my senior year at a new high school. But I get back to the States and I start college at the University of South Carolina. Well, I had wanted to major in pre-law. And my dad, who paid my tuition for my first semester, he said, I'll pay your first semester, and after that, it's totally on your own. But there is no way a son of mine is going to go be a lawyer. The world has too many lawyers, and I don't want anything to do with them. So you're not going to be a lawyer. And I'm thinking, well, you're writing a check for me to go to school, at least for my first semester. So I went undeclared my first semester at Carolina. And in my first semester, most of the classes that I took were in the sciences. And almost everybody in my class was in pre-med. And amazing to everybody that knew me, I actually was making all A's in those classes. And I'm thinking, hey, being a doctor is kind of cool. Maybe I'll change my major to pre-med and be a doctor. I can do this. And then my second semester came along after I changed my major to pre-med. And I met Jenny McDowell, and my first big college crush, and I will never forget this, on February 13th, 1980, I had planned this big date for Valentine's Day, and we were going to go to Steak and Ale, which is a really big, expensive restaurant in Columbia, and I had flowers, and even though it wasn't the Hope Diamond, I had gone out to JCPenney and bought one of those $29.95 heart-shaped pendants, and it was a big deal for me on my budget. And on February 13th, I called her up and I said, "You ready for tomorrow night?" And there was silence. I mean, this isn't good. I said, "Aren't you excited about tomorrow? I got everything set. I'll come and pick you up at 6:30, and then we're going to go do this, and then we'll go to dinner." And there's silence. And I said, "Jenny, what's wrong?" She goes, "Well, my old boyfriend stopped by the house last night, and I decided to get back with him. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. As it turns out, I couldn't go to class. that wasn't Jenny's fault. That was all on me. I just used it as an excuse. But anyway, they went med school. My counselor said there is no way you're ever going to get into med school because you completely bombed an entire semester. So as it turned out, my choices were very, very limited on what degree program I could go into. And out of the choices that were available, I picked journalism. It turns out, at that time in the early 80s, University of South Carolina had one of the top 10 journalism programs in the nation. And it wasn't an easy program. It was a very difficult program, but I had a lot of fun in it. I really enjoyed it, learned a lot. In fact, the very first story I covered was when Ronald Reagan and George Bush came to Columbia, South Carolina to debate during the 1980 presidential election cycle for the Republican nomination. I got to cover that story, which I should have thought, man, this is an omen here. This is pretty big. But at the time, I had no intention of going into the newspaper business. I just thought, this is a piece of paper I can hang on the wall to show that when I went to college, I did something else besides drink beer and go to football games. And that was really my motivation, because I was going to write books. That's what I was going to do for a living. So I finish up college, and I decide at the time I'm going to go in the Navy. And the reason is, in the early 80s, I know a lot of you probably remember, we were in the midst of a pretty big recession, and there wasn't a whole lot of jobs available. And I was watching the Super Bowl, and this commercial came on, need a job but don't have experience. How do you get experience? Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. And I thought, why not? Could do worse. So I decided to go enlist in the Navy. And my dad was career Army. He was still in the Army at the time, and he told me pretty much my entire life, if you ever go in the Army, I'm going to kick your butt. And I believe him. My dad said he was going to do something. He did. So I thought, well, let's go in the Navy. Being on a ship sounds kind of cool. Traveling the world sounds kind of exotic. Yeah, I could do that. And but I didn't enlist as a journalist. My initial enlistment, I was going to be a navigator. I took the test. I scored in the top 10% in the country. I couldn't be a pilot because I didn't have 20/20 vision. So I was going to go to OCS and become a navigator. And the only problem was, because there was this huge recession, the recruiter came to me and he said, you scored in the top 10% in the nation, your scores are great, but we have Georgia Tech engineer grads who are ahead of you on the list, so it ain't going to happen. If you want to enlist, you can enlist. So I said, all right, let's talk about enlistment. What can I do as in the enlisted ranks? And I took the ASVAB test. He goes, you're qualified for anything. Pick and choose. So I'm thinking, I lived in Germany for 3 years. I spoke German fluently. I said, how about a translator? He goes, yeah, we have translating jobs in the Navy. But, and I said, well, sign me up for German, because I figured I'm already way ahead of everybody on that. And he goes, well, the Navy only offers 2 languages for translators, Russian and Farsi. And I'm thinking, okay, what all does this entail? And so the recruiter's explaining it to me. For 18 months, you get to live in beautiful Monterey, California, and you go to the Defense Language Program. Well, you'll be studying Russian intensely. At the end of 18 months, then what we're going to do is we'll send you to cryptology school. I go, what's cryptology school? And he goes, well, it's like spy stuff. You learn how to decipher codes and make codes and all of this stuff. And I said, okay, then what? And he goes, then we'll either send you to air crew school or we'll send you to sub school, because for the next 4 years of your life, you'll either be on a submarine under the water or in an airplane up in the sky, intercepting Russian transmissions and then translating them and then sending them to naval intelligence. And I'm talking, 6 years, huh? He goes, yep, 6 years. Man, that sounds fun. Sign me up. Let's do it. And he goes, you sure you don't want to take the nuke test? And I go, the nuke test? He goes, yeah, we really need nuclear technicians. And I go, yeah. And this was shortly after 3 Mile Island. I'm like, no, I don't want to be anywhere near nuclear reactors. I'll do the cryptology stuff. So I was in the delayed entry program, and in the delayed entry program, you have to meet at the recruiter's office once a month. So my very first delayed entry recruiter meeting shows up, and I come, and they had a guy who just finished boot camp. Now don't ask me why, but all of us in the room, and I was probably the oldest one. I was 22 years old, and the rest were probably 17, 18-year-old guys. We're sitting in there listening to this guy who just finished boot camp tell us all about the Navy as if he's some old salt and knows everything. And he finishes his talk about boot camp, and he goes around the room and goes, "What'd you sign up for? What'd you sign?" And he gets to me, and I tell him. And he goes, how long's your contract? I said, 6 years. And he goes, IBM for 6 years. I go, IBM? What's an IBM? And he goes, Instant Boatswain's Mate. I go, what's an Instant Boatswain's Mate? And he goes, you know those commercials on TV where you see the guys hanging off the ship, shipping paint, and then swabbing the deck? And he goes, I said, yeah. And he goes, that's a boatswain's mate. 6 years. He goes, I'm not a boatswain's mate. I'm signing up for a translator cryptologist. And he goes, you don't understand. If you fail the school, they make you an IBM, instant boatswain's mate. You got a 6-year contract. You're going to be chipping paint for 6 years. Okay, Carolina's journalism school was very good. They taught us to ask questions, don't take anything at face value. Did I remember anything I learned in college? No. It went in one ear and out the other because for the next 24 hours, I was so panic-stricken about becoming an IBM that the very next morning, I didn't even sleep that night. Next morning, recruiter's office opened at 8 o'clock. I was waiting on him. I said, you got to get me out of this contract. You got to get me out. I can't be an IBM. I can't. And he goes, what are you talking about? I said, okay, you wanted me to take the nuke test. And he said, yeah, you're qualified for it. And I said, can I still take the nuke test? And he goes, well, yeah, but we'd have to rip up your contract to do that and start all over from scratch. I said, okay, sign me up. We're done. I can't do 6 years of this. I never even asked the recruiter, is it true? Never even asked. I just took this guy who finished boot camp word for it that he knew what he was talking about. So I took the nuke, they tore up my contract, I took the test for the nuke program. Just to make sure I didn't pass it, I did the ABC, 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 ABC. I finished it in 3.5 minutes. Normally it's about a 2-hour test. And turned it in, recruiter said, you failed the nuke test. And I said, okay, so what happens now? And he goes, well, now you get we spin the wheel and see what jobs are available. You qualify for everything. I said, well, let's spin the wheel. So he calls up the detailer in Washington, D.C., and they came back several options, and the one of the options on the list was they needed a journalist. I said, I majored in journalism in college. I can do this. I know that there's no way I'm going to flunk the journalism program. I'm not going to be an IBM. So I signed up to become a Navy journalist. Turns out, next to the nuke program, the journalism program had the highest washout rate of all the schools in the military. We had people in my class that had negative grade point averages, and at the end of every week in class, you get a grade. And if you're below 70, you're on probation, and if you're below 70 the next week, they wash out. We started with 56 people in my class. We graduated 21. It was very, very tough school. I graduated honor grad, but actually, it was a 3-way tie for honor grad out of my class. I went to the University of South Carolina. There was another sailor who went to Yale, majored in journalism. And then there was a Marine who majored in journalism at UCLA. And the three of us, there was a fraction of a point difference in our grade point average. So we had one of the few classes that had more than one honor grad. But that kind of gives you some indication of how tough that school was. So I became a Navy journalist, spent 3 years on the USS Buchanan, home ported out of San Diego, worked for Navy News This Week, TDY assignments, Navy Public Affairs, got to do a lot of really cool, interesting stuff. But I'm thinking, when my time's up in the Navy, I'm done with journalism, I'm going to do something else. Actually, my initial dream was I was going to take my GI Bill and finish my tour, and then I was going to go to the Brooks Institute of Photography, which was one of the premier photo schools in the world, and leverage that into getting a job with National Geographic as a photojournalist. Because I was a big fan of National Geographic. In fact, my hero was Steve Raymer, who was one of the top National Geographic photographers. And funny thing how crosswinds tend to blow you off course, because I ended up meeting my wife, got married, started a family. So when it came time to get out of the Navy, I needed to get a job. And I'm thinking, what do I have experience at? And I said, well, I majored in journalism in college. I was a Navy journalist. So I ended up getting a job at a newspaper, which is something that I thought I'd never do. And one of my very first jobs at a daily paper was in Beloit, Wisconsin. And the former editor, he retired before I started working on the staff, but just a wonderful man, wonderful man, Larry Raymer. He kind of adopted me. And my first year at a daily newspaper was a nightmare. In fact, I didn't think I was going to make it through probation. Every day I come into work and the editor had just redlined the entire paper, anything that I had to do with the paper, and it was sitting on the back of my chair. So every morning I come in and I pick up the paper and I look at all the red ink, and I'm thinking, oh man, today's the day he's going to fire me. But Larry took me under his wing, and he would take me out in the community and introduce me to people. Here's somebody you really need to know. And then when he introduced me to them, he goes, this is Neal White. He's a rising star. He's going to be great. He's great for our community. I'm thinking, Larry, you know, my boss Bill is getting ready to fire me. Why are you pumping me up to everybody? Because I'm not that, everything you say I am. But he said, don't worry about it. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. And every week I get a letter in the mail from Larry, and I'd open it up, and he'd cut out one of my stories. And they were nothing great by any stretch of the imagination. But he would, you know, take magic markers and put exclamation points around them and then write a note at the top, great job, you're doing super. I mean, these words of encouragement. And that kind of kept me going through the first year. But we had a standing lunch date every week, and Larry and I would go out to lunch. And I remember, this was like 2 or 3 years after I'd been working there, and we were at lunch, and he goes, my son's coming home. I hadn't seen him in about 6 years. And I knew Larry had a family, but he rarely talked about his kids. And I said, 6 years? Why haven't you seen your son in 6 years? And he goes, well, he's been working in Russia. And this was still, you know, the Cold War hadn't been over that long, certainly not 6 years over. And I said, how come your son's in Russia for 6 years? He goes, oh, he's the bureau chief for National Geographic in Russia. And then it dawned on me, I mean, it was like a lightning bolt hit me, and I just looked at him and I said, Larry, is your son Steve? And he goes, yeah, you know him? I go, no, but I've always wanted to meet him. He's one of my heroes. And I said, when he comes home, you've got to introduce me to him. And he did, and Steve and I actually got to be very good friends. When Larry passed away at his funeral, I was working my way through the line, and Steve was in the receiving line, and I came up and gave him a big hug, and we both started crying. He goes, look at us, a couple of tough guy journalists. Why are we crying? And I said, I think Larry would understand. But it's interesting because even though I never thought I would be in newspaper journalism, and when I decided I was going to be a journalist, I was going to be a photojournalist with National Geographic. But what I ended up being was like Steve's dad, Larry, who was this just magnanimous, humble guy that was really a pillar in the community, who did so much for so many others. And I can't even describe how wonderful Larry was and how much he meant to me. And I ended up following or trying my best to follow in Larry's footsteps when I started off wanting to be in Steve's footsteps. And the reason I share all these stories with you is 30 years ago, I wanted to be here in front of all of you. I wanted to do this 30 years ago, but I couldn't have written this book unless I kept getting blown off course throughout my life, and the crosswinds hadn't taken me in different directions. And for those of you that have read my book or want to read my book, there's a lot of North Carolina hillbilly heritage in here, and that's from my roots. That's what I knew. That's what I was comfortable with. And the stories are all fiction. It's a fictional book, but they come from my experiences as a 30-year career journalist. All of the locations that are in the book, I've been to. I've lived parts of it. I can't say the stories are fiction. I made them up. They're figments of my imagination, but the settings are very, very real. And when I started to write this book, I didn't have an outline. I didn't have a plan. The only thing I knew is I had the very first line of the book. I knew that was it. And then I started, okay, I got to write this book. I'm going to do it. What am I going to write about? And the first thing that came to mind was when I finished DIMFOS, which is Defense Information School in Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indianapolis, which is where all the military, it's a joint service school for everybody that works in public affairs and journalism in the military. They gave me 30 days leave. My ship was in Subic Bay, the Philippines, so they said, you're going to be overseas for who knows how long, so go spend some time with your family. So I took 30 days leave and went to Columbia, South Carolina with my parents. I got on a plane the first part of May in 1985, and flew from Columbia, South Carolina to Manila in the Philippines. And when I got on the very first plane, I think I had 35 cents in my pocket because I hadn't been paid in a month, and I wasn't going to get paid till I got to the ship. And I had a layover in St. Louis, and I met somebody who saw me in uniform. I was in my Cracker Jacks, and bought me lunch, gave me a pack of cigarettes, and I never forgot that. It actually gave me some money. He goes, yeah. I said, no, I don't want your money. That's fine. I appreciate your hospitality and generosity. He goes, you got a long flight ahead of you. You don't know what you might run into. So here, I think he handed me a $10 bill, and I never forgot that. So I fly back to South Carolina. And more times than not, I would fly through Charlotte Douglas Airport. And in 2005, there was actually a restaurant in the airport called the NASCAR Bar and Grill. And it happened to be the only place in the entire airport you could smoke. It's no longer gone. Charlotte Douglas has gone smoke free, so if you're anti-smoking, they beat you to that. But that became the setting for my book. And in the book, it begins, all the flights are delayed because there's this torrential storm that's blowing through Charlotte, and Bobby's on his way. His parents dropped him off at 4 o'clock in the morning because he had a 6 o'clock flight, and they left. They went back to their home in western North Carolina, and after several delays, Bobby couldn't take it anymore, and he was broke because he wasn't going to get paid till he got to his ship. He decided to go in the NASCAR Bar and Grill and see if he could find somebody to bum a cigarette. Turns out, this elderly gentleman in a blue jacket named Jack, and they struck up a friendship, and that friendship, that conversation extended over the next 18 hours until they opened the airport up the next morning. And by the way, I've actually done that. A couple of times I've spent all night in the airport because of storms. One of them was in Anchorage, Alaska, which is a chapter in the book. And there's another chapter in the book about Baja. I happened to spend a week in Baja on a car program that I was on, going back to my car heritage here. where we did 500 miles of the Baja 1000. And halfway through the trip, it was a Volvo program, they decided that we're going to make a little detour here. And well, pretty much the entire trip was off-road, so I was going to say we went off-road, but the whole thing was pretty much off-road. We make this detour and we come into this really tiny little fishing village. And as this fleet of Volvo XC70s pull into the village, all these kids come running up, and Volvo had given us these backpacks to give to the kids for the school. And as we got out of the car, we opened up the trunk and we started handing out these backpacks, and they said, "There's the school." And it was a 10 by 10 cinder block building with a thatch roof, and there was no door, no windows. They had, no blocks where the window would be. And after we visited with the kids, a couple of us walked over and we peeked in where the window would be if they had a glass window, and stuck our head inside the school. They had a couple of chairs just like this and one desk for the teacher, and there was a globe on the teacher's desk. That was it for the entire, equipment for the school. But I had never met so many happy people in my life who had nothing, and they all lived in these makeshift houses, if you could even call them a house. They were, what they lived in, they took like fallen down billboards and corrugated tin and somehow shackled it together to make a structure, and that's what they lived out of. There was no running water. There was a pipe that came in from the government that brought in fresh water, then that was their fresh water, and then they fished for a living. And they had literally nothing in the world of physical, monetary means, but they were the happiest people, some of the happiest people I've ever met in my life. And I never forgot that experience and the relationships that I made with those people in that 2-hour time period that we were there. And that became the basis for the Baja chapter in my book. One of the other chapters in the book is the Willie chapter. And I don't want to give anything away or spoil it, because it's one of my favorite chapters in there. But when I was telling you all earlier about my friendship with Darryl Black when I was in 4th grade at Denny Terrace Elementary School, that became the foundation for the Willie chapter in the book. There's just so many experiences that I have, and the characters in there are an amalgamation of everybody that I've met and worked with and associated with. And while 30 years ago I thought I was going to be this hotshot, best-selling author and spend the rest of my life doing what I'm doing tonight for the very first time, I'm so grateful and so excited to finally be able to do that. I never could have written this book unless I had been blown off course so many times during my life to do what I think God meant for me to be doing. And so that's, in a nutshell, the story of Crosswinds. And at this time, I see we only have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to open it up for any questions. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned your friend Darryl Black. Have you kept up with him? Do you know what he's doing these days?
We lost touch when I moved to Germany, and I've never been able to connect with him again.
So he's not on Facebook?
There's so many Darryl Blacks.
So do you miss being an IBM?
I actually spent 6 months in the yards. When we got back from the Philippines, my ship went into dry dock in Long Beach, California, and it was the worst 6 months of my life, where I actually had to do chipping paint, removing asbestos, and I would get up at 4 o'clock every morning. There was a bank of payphones on the pier where our ship was, to be the first one in line to call the detailer in Washington, D.C. and say, "Get me the hell out of here." I hated that. Yes, ma'am.
When do you do your best writing? What time of day?
That's a great question. There's a story about how this book came to be. And in 2010, out of the blue, I received a phone call from somebody I went to high school with in Germany. And to back up a little bit, when I was working at my first daily newspaper in Beloit, Wisconsin, where I thought that my editor was going to fire me the entire first year, in 1994, I was in the it was like 5 o'clock in the evening, and there was only 2 of us left in the newsroom, Rob Baxter, who was the regional editor, me. The editor comes down to our desk and says, I just got a call that a white buffalo had been born in Janesville, Wisconsin. One of you guys got to go cover it. And I looked at Rob and I said, Rob, you're the regional editor, Janesville's in the region. If you'll take it, I'll go shoot the pictures for you. And Rob goes, no, I promised my wife I'd be home for dinner, it's all yours. That story made my career. I ended up spending the next 2 years covering the white buffalo story and got to meet, what a humbling experience, life-changing experience. But as a writer, as a journalist, that story was, I did, I think, a total of 50 stories. And that story was, those stories was where I found my voice as a journalist. It catapulted my career without question. But anyway, getting back, I get this call from a friend I went to high school with in Germany who had read the story about the white buffalo and said, Neal White, I went to high school with the Neal White, I wonder if it's the same guy. She called, tracked me down on Facebook, and I said, yeah, it's me. And then we were doing the whole catch-up, what have you been up to the last 35 years, what have you been doing? And it turns out she had followed her father's heritage. Her father was Native American, and she decided to move to Canada where her father was on the reservation, or grew up on a reservation in New Brunswick, Canada, and she was a scientist. She was working with the assembly and working with the New Brunswick University as the water grandmother, and part of her job was to get kids interested in science on the reservation, but the big problem was getting kids not only into high school on the reservation, but getting them through high school on the reservation, because the dropout rate was just astronomical. And as she was telling me this, I finally cut her off mid-sentence. I said, let me tell you about Global High. And if you ever want to get me worked up about something, just bring up Global High, because I am a huge, huge proponent of Global High and what they're capable of doing. So we get into this long conversation, and I said, if you ever come to Texas, let me know. I'll be happy to give you a tour of Global High and introduce you to all the people that helped create it. And about a month later, she shows up and goes, okay, show me Global High. Set up the interviews. I'll be there on Tuesday. And she actually, I helped her. She did all the heavy lifting and all the work. I just helped, but got a grant to do a pilot project on the reservation in New Brunswick, similar to what Global High did. And through the course of that, she says, you know, are you happy? What do you want to do in life? And I said, well, I've always wanted to write a book. She goes, why don't you? And then I went through the whole laundry list of don't have time. I spend 12 hours a day in front of a computer writing. Last thing I want to do is go home and write. And besides, it's so hard to get published. On, yada, 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 yada. And she just, pardon my French, but she goes, bullshit, Neal. If you want to write a book, write a book. I got a house in the woods. We have electricity, but we do not have TV. We do not have internet. I only have a wood-burning stove, but it's very isolated, and you come up and write to your heart's content. So in March of 2011, I get on a plane to start working on this book, flying into New Brunswick, and the only thing I knew was the very first sentence of the book. And by the time I got to New Brunswick, I had, okay, it's going to be at Charlotte Douglas Airport, and it's going to be about Jack and Bobby. But at the time, Jack didn't have a name. In fact, the entire book was written before I named Jack. Throughout the entire book, it was the man in the blue jacket. So anyway, that's how the book came to be. And I know, yeah, long answer to a very simple question, but in that cabin there was 8 feet of snow on the ground. It was very isolated, and I just put on my headphones and listened to music and sat down with my laptop, and the words just literally flew off my fingers, and that was very, very easy to do the writing. 2 years later, when I finished the book, I would come home from work, and it was actually like a job. Every day I would come home and I would write for anywhere from 2 hours to sometimes I just did all-nighters if I really got in the mood. But there's times where I love to write where I'm in the muse is hitting and everything's just flowing, but that's not all the time. Sometimes you just really have to buckle down and say, this is a job, you gotta hammer it out and get it done. Yes, ma'am.
So I've heard people say that are authors like that it's almost like you give birth to that book. How do you then prepare yourself for the rest of the series that you want to do?
Very good question. This started out without any outline, anything. And I was finishing up this book in the late summer 2013. And I remember one of my last visits to the farm in Janesville, Wisconsin, and I got very close with a lot of the Native American spiritual leaders. One of them was Harry Brownbeer. He was an Oneida elder from northern Wisconsin, and he would visit the farm quite frequently. And we were at the farm, and I remember looking at Harry, and I said, Harry, why me? Because there were over 2,000 journalists over that 2-year period that covered this story. But I was the one that, I felt like I had carte blanche access to everybody. And a lot of times the Native American spiritual leaders and elders and chiefs would come to the farm from all over the United States and hold sacred ceremonies. And for some reason, I would be like the only journalist that would be allowed to take part in those ceremonies because they were pretty much off limits all the time. And I never understood why. Why did I get that access, that honor? Because it was a huge honor. I mean, extremely huge honor. Geraldo Rivera was there, and they said, get the hell out of here. You're not going to turn on your cameras. And so I was asking Harry, and he said, well, you're here to tell the story. And I said, Harry, I've written like 50 stories on the white buffalo. I don't know what else I'm supposed to do. And he taps me on the chest and he goes, when the time comes, you'll know. Follow your heart. He said, follow your heart. So anyway, I'm in the late summer of 2013. I'm working frantically to finish up this book, to get it done. And I have this epiphany. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning. And I was working on the Willie chapter, as a matter of fact. And this epiphany came to me that this is the first book in the white buffaloes, and telling the white buffalo story. And all of a sudden, I pulled out my notebook and I started taking notes and I started making an outline. And the second book, which is called Wind Speaker, I had a complete outline in about 30 minutes. And then I didn't stop. I took the third book, which the title for the third book is going to be called Wind Shear, and I had the complete outline. And Wind Speaker and Wind Shear are all based on the Sioux prophecies that are tied directly to the white buffalo, and why the white buffalo calf lady returned, and what it means to mankind, and how mankind can make a difference on this earth. And you look around and see everything that's happening in the world, it's exactly what the Sioux prophecy stated. And so I finished up Crosswinds, never thought it would ever be published. Alex Allred, who is a frequent columnist for the paper, came in one day to see if I would run one of her columns, and I said, sure, I'd be happy to. And I said, okay, because Alex she's published about 24 books. She's very well known, very established author, And I was really asking her for, some guidance. What do you, now that I finished my book, what do you do now? And instead I said, I finished my manuscript, would you read it for me? And I could tell the minute the word had come out of my mouth, I put her on the spot. And she just had this horrified, terrified look in her face, and she had come in to ask me for a favor, or I asked her for a favor, and it was one of those really awkward moments. And she goes, okay, send it to me. And then she just darted out of the paper really quickly. And so I did. I didn't hear from her for about 2 weeks, and I'm thinking, I just completely lost a friend there. About 2 weeks later, I get this email from her. And you know how when you bring up an email on a computer, you can only read so much on the screen and you have to scroll it up. Well, the very first part on the screen, she's explaining why she never agrees to read unpublished manuscripts. One, I'm a published author and I don't ever want to be accused of plagiarism in case, I read something and it ends up in one of my books and then people turn around and sue me. And then it said, but more importantly is I don't like to do it because I don't like to lose friendships, because most of the people who give me manuscripts to read, they're absolutely horrible. And I have to go tell them, this is horrible. And I'm thinking, okay, here it comes. Here it comes. Just get it over with. Just go ahead and shoot me, be done with it. And I scroll up. And as I scrolled up the email, I said, and then I read your manuscript. OMG. And the rest of it was just like, I had to stop mid-chapter and call my sister, and I'm reading passages out of your book to my sister. And then she ended the manuscript with, I have some friends in the publishing industry. Would it be okay if I submitted your manuscript to them? I'm like, okay. By all means. And I really didn't expect anything to happen. I wanted to write this book because it's something, I wanted to write a book, and not necessarily this book, but I wanted to write a book because I've always wanted to finish a book. And when I started, I thought, I'll print it out on the copy machine and make a couple of copies and stick it in a notebook and give it to my kids and say, your dad wrote a book. I'm finishing up Windspeaker now, and Windspeaker I'm more excited about than I was about Crosswinds, because I knew what Windspeaker is going to be going into it, and I really get to get into the White Buffalo story on Windspeaker. And it picks up 4 years after Crosswinds ends. And I'll give you a little sneak peek of Windspeaker. It starts off in Diego Garcia. Bobby he has 1 month left on his tour in the Navy, and they're in Diego Garcia his ship is in Diego Garcia for repairs, which is in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And shortly after his ship pulls in, they were in port for 2 weeks. His best friend on the ship, who's the corpsman, gets called for special duty and leaves the ship. Well, they're getting ready to pull out of port to head back to the States, and Bobby's notified that his friend was killed on this mission. And he gets called to the captain's quarters, and his friend had left a just-in-case note and addressed it to Bobby, and the captain handed it to him, and he opens it up, and his friend says, would you please go to Oklahoma to visit my wife? She's 9 months pregnant and expecting our first child. And the captain agrees to give Bobby an early discharge to let him fly back to the States. And he goes, and he doesn't even know where his friend's wife lives, but it turns out she lives on an Indian reservation in Oklahoma. And that's how Crosswinds begins, or Windspeaker begins.